rather than have each of you explain your work directly, I would like to, starting with Victor and going in this direction, have each of you, if you can, describe the moment in your life, and probably earlier in your life, when you started to think about learning in a very different way, and about motivation ability of young people in a very different way. If you need time, we'll give you some time.
Okay. Well, actually, we were just talking about that. I was just asked about what was that moment that turned around my educational trajectory. And I don't know if I can use the same vocabulary I was using back there, but I was absolutely frustrated and disconnected in schools. And I attended a number of schools in a 10-year educational history and just completely turned off by schools altogether. I was lucky to be running on the track here at San Diego City College, and there happened to be a track coach there just serendipitously. In fact, he was the only one from the athletic department that was even out that day. So they invited me to run on the team, and without a high school diploma, I was even reluctant to go to school. They held my hand and walked me through the registration process, and I started running for the school, and I was just telling a story how I turned in my first paper, one of my first classes, and the teacher gave me an F on it, and when I went to go see him about it, he pretty much chewed me out and cussed me out, which I had heard many times in my life. And I usually would be grinning when other teachers would tell me that, and this moment was very different. I left out of his office, and I was in tears, I think, before I even left his office. So I started, and that professor was Latino. I think that's an important distinction also, because that was the first time I'd ever had a Latino teacher. And so to have him cuss me out and told me that I was a piece of shit, and that I was taking somebody's spot by being there, and that if I was going to be there, I needed to like get my shit together. And it sunk in, and I went to tutoring the next morning, and I got my act together. And at that point, I was afraid to fail, and previously I hadn't been, because I was failing so frequently. But at that point, I didn't want to fail any longer, and so that was the moment for me. And I was also in my early 20s at that point, so it took me a while to get the thing going upstairs. So
great, thanks, Victor. Albert, you ready?
Yeah, sure. I had a similar, actually, come to Jesus moment with my PhD advisor when I was complaining too much about. I did a PhD in engineering, and there's a long phase of just sort of sitting still and checking your emails, and that was right when Facebook was showing up and MySpace. So spending your whole time basically trying to figure out how to be cooler in social media instead of doing work. And one day I complained just a little too much, and then my advisor said he told me that I was a dime a dozen. He brought me into his office, showed me a stack about this big of applicants to fill my spot, and said, if you're ready for this, I'll fill your spot tomorrow. But that wasn't really, I think, what I was going to say. I think for me, the moment, I loved school. I loved it. I had a great time at school. My father was an academic. My mother was a teacher as well, a piano teacher. So I just always was surrounded by educators, and I grew up both here in the States and also in Cambridge in England. And school was awesome. The cafeteria in Cambridge was like, I just can't stop thinking about it. It was such good food. But then, I did pretty well. I finished, and the moment that everything changed for me was after I finished my PhD, I was all of a sudden in the real world with just sort of this like deer in the headlights moment of what am I supposed to do now? And I remember very distinctly realizing for the first time that there was still a bunch of stuff that hadn't been figured out in the science world, right? That like education up until that point was reading all these textbooks and everything like that, and reading about what people had found, and learning all the theories and all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, well now that I'm trained, what do? And all of a sudden I started realizing that there was all this unanswered stuff happening out there in science. And that was when I realized that science is less about the known and more about the unknown, about the curiosity of it all. So that was probably the most sort of aha moment for me.
That's great. Good. Emily?
I guess my answer is sort of a bookend. There were two moments that framed this long period of time in my life. The first was in second grade when we had a competition to see who could use chopsticks the best and move like the most gummy bears from one plate to another. I'm half Chinese, and I lost. And everyone made fun of me, like, you're Asian, aren't you supposed to be good at using chopsticks? And I was like, oh my God, I'm not. Like, I'm not a good Chinese girl or a chopsticks user and all these other things. So that was the first moment where I started to question, like, my own identity in a totally white school. And the first moment I remember feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. And then the other bookend is sort of the answer to that question, that I went to UC Berkeley for architecture, great program, but I hated it. And I just like didn't really, I mean, I loved the architecture part, but I hated the structure of it, and I still just felt very lost. And it wasn't until I started at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, which is a much smaller design and art program, and that was the first time I felt like I found my people, both fellow students and teachers who really not only gave the space to be an individual and express that, but actually your success depended on it. And it gave me permission to answer all those questions I had as a learner.
Great, thank you. Elbow?
All right, well, I've had a lot of moments, and the last blog I wrote, I said this last week, is just recently on my mind, is that, you know, that marshmallow study. I wrote a blog called I Ate the Marshmallow, because that's who I am. I'm kind of impulsive, and I've always been fascinated by non-text-based learning, that you're smart without books. Not that I don't love books, but I love them. So I'll tell the story that Larry likes me to tell.
I love that
which
story.
Is non-text based, which is a true story. So when I was about 11 or 12 years old, my dad, who never finished what we would call junior, 8th grade, he never finished the 8th grade, and one of his best buddies, who never finished the 3rd grade, we were best friends as sons, you know, fathers and sons. And Richie was arguably one of the best, if not the best, pool player of his time. And so we wanted to take our dads to show them that we could play pool, so they, like all good dads, took us to a real pool parlor in those days, a place called Spot and Q in Brooklyn on Lincoln Road. And you're not supposed to be there when you were a little kid back then. And we shot around a little bit, and then Richie looked at my dad and looked at us, who was the really good pool player, and said, you two don't have any talent, you better stay in school. Which meant to me that if you had talent and your family knew it in those days, and arguably today, you leave. And how come we can't keep young people in school became a quest and a question for me, who have incredible talents that schools don't honor and recognize for a variety of reasons.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to tell mine. I'm going to answer my own question, because I see Charlie out there, one of my favorite teachers on the planet. Come on, put your hand up. Don't be too shy. Come on, that's Charlie. I love what she's doing in there with those kids. So I'd gone to law school to study prisoners' rights for some reason, and then I was an unmarried single dad, and I was working as a carpenter, and there was a settlement house back east where I was dating myself, a dark room upstairs, and making a lot of noise up there, up and doing big beam work. And these kids, working class kids, would come at the end of the school day to play dodgeball and go bananas downstairs and do whatever they wanted. And they started to hear noise, and they started coming upstairs because they liked the noise. And they saw me working with tools, and they said, "What are you doing?" I started showing them how to use tools. And then I started to realize I was looking forward to 3 o'clock. It was my favorite part of the day, the time the kids came. And then I started to realize these kids could run around and go bananas and do whatever they want to do, but they'd rather come up here and make something that wasn't there before. And that's when I really started thinking about what great satisfaction all of us here and all of you here get from making things. It's kind of a natural thing to do. Okay, so I've got a really interesting question here that somebody wrote, which says for me, we've heard rumors that someone on this stage may be nominated and confirmed as U.S. Secretary of Education in the next presidential administration. As the new U.S. Secretary of Education, what will you do? First of all, I'm going to offer you my profound condolences. And does anybody want to take a shot at what you would do if you could change the world of education at the federal level? And while you're thinking, one of the challenges that we have about the federal level is that this country really still has essentially a state-based and local-based system, so the federal authority has some real limitations. Anyone want to take a shot at that? No? All right.
Things.
What?
Things, yeah.
Go ahead.
So something that's pretty simple. is a learning plan for every student developed longitudinally that doesn't just focus on academics, but focuses as well on your interest and your social emotional growth, and that people pay attention to those things. The other thing I change is, I want to try to have a Supreme Court case about this when I've got a little bit more time, is that people are smart in all different kinds of ways, and there's always two sets of books out there that we have to keep if you're not smart in just a text-based way. And we know way too much about that now to not recognize and acknowledge how people are smart in all kinds of ways. And we know a lot more about issues of equity, not just race, class, and gender, but also personality, around looking at each and every child, and that's part of that learning plan piece, and part of how we're smart in all kinds of different ways that we can credit, measure, and acknowledge that we don't.
Okay, great. Is that you? Are you gonna, you're picking it up?
I'm going to pass on this one.
You're going to pass on this one? Okay. We got to take her over here.
Okay, I'll take a stab. At the risk of maybe pushing a few buttons. So here's what I think about. There are a number of problems that public education is grappling with. I think one that we all grapple with is the achievement gap. So if I had a magic wand, I would try to move heaven and earth to get a ridiculous number. I don't know, let's call it like 10,000 African American and Latino men specifically into public education. I would say like, and specifically targeting TK through 6, and infiltrate schools and communities with men specifically in the communities that we're thinking of, where there are great disparities and a number of predictable outcomes, and create both a cohort and a network among the men that would be working in these communities, the curricula, the outcomes, the social services, the psychosocial supports. There's just so much trauma. There's so many things that our young people are dealing with outside of the school setting, that I just feel like it needs that level of inoculation. I don't know. That's something that I do think about deeply.
All right. So career and technical education came from a couple of things. 1880, we had this law that was passed called the Morrill, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, not like morals, but the Morrill Act. That was the first piece of federal legislation, and that is how all the state colleges actually got funded. And that was for colleges to teach agriculture teachers how to teach agriculture so that we could develop an agrarian economy. The next time was 1917, and that's where Career and Tech actually created with the Smith-Hughes Act. I'm bringing this up because because of what's going on in the country right now, every time the country gets scared, there's a few things that happen. They cut off immigrants. They have an anti-immigrant that's happened in 1917. It happened in the late 30s. It happened, that train is never late, and it's happening one more time. So we have this great need, because everyone in this country, even Native Americans, everyone in this country came from someplace else. To go back to, I think Victor's 2 points, basically, is that we're here to discuss matters of pedagogy and constructivism and making things that weren't there before. And then we've got this uber thing over it, which are matters of equity. And this idea that actually these kids should work with their hands and those kids should work with their heads. And we're essentially saying that people should do both and do both well. So you've done some work with, am I scaring you by letting you? The question is, can you give some examples of your own work of doing exactly that with young people?
You mean specifically around the Venn diagram of head and hands? So there's this very obscure text, which maybe some of you have heard of, by Charles Ham, that was written in like 1899. It's like the co-education of hand and mind. So it must have followed the 1880. Anyway, if any of you haven't read it, I think it's in the National Library of Congress. It's free and open source. It's an amazing text, and it talks exactly about this, that the hand and the mind are not two separate tracks, that they are intrinsically like inseparable when education is done well. And so I it's actually very difficult for me to think of them as separate because I've worked with my hands since I was like probably this big, and that's the way that's how my brain turns on. And so I don't know, and when I work with young people, I think it's almost just like reminding them of that like we can be on Instagram and Tumblr all day long, and many people will say like, oh, but you know, kids these days are interested in these things. And that's probably true, but they are also incredibly like hungry for really hands-on, mucky, gritty work. And I think with the question of equity, I mean, and there is this like, you know, huge stigma around the word vocational and whatever, but I think that's on us to rethink what we're making and why. So like, I was saying to someone earlier that the majority of the students at Realm are Latino, and I've been asked a number of times, like, well, are you just training more construction workers? And is this just about labor? And it's not. And the reason why I can say it's not is because there is a why that I think that they understand that this is, just like I talked about earlier, like I can teach you all those things on those lists, but I want you to leave knowing that you can serve your community, you can think about things rigorously, you can apply it to med school, and the fact that you built a micro home will make you a better applicant. So I think it's about connecting to the person and the community, and that's what makes all of those so-called, in some cases like blue-collar skills more valuable, is that it does connect to your mind and also to your heart, that there's like a sense of meaning to them.
You know, and for me, I taught carpentry, so I'm a Vokey. I taught carpentry in Boston for 15 years to inner city kids at the height of desegregation, which was quite ugly. I mean, I saw people throwing bricks at kids in buses, just like happened in Mississippi, and realized the first day that I was working with those kids that they were every bit as bright as the middle-class kids I had just been in law school with. Some of them didn't realize it or didn't think of themselves that way, but they were. You know, Elliot, you've done a lot of reading and thinking about this question of the use of the hand and the brain. You want to say something about that?
Sure, and the heart as well, because it's cordata, the word for Latin for heart, is twist. It's all twisted together. And ancients knew that across all cultures. So just a little bit different take around, there's all kinds of different histories out there and parallels. So in Europe at the time, in the 1880s, there was a movement called the Sloyd Movement of Education, which was started by Otto Salomon and a fellow called Signaeus, who is actually Pasi Solberg's great-great-great-grand something or other. And I ran into him in a bar last week in Austin, Texas. Never met him before, playing shuffle bowling. And we talked about that. And I talked about this with him because I said, I know that the Finnish education and Swedish education to this day has either you work with textiles, wood, ceramics, or metal, K to 12. You're always working with your hands, and it's not about the development of vocational education. It's development of experiencing the world through your senses and metaphor to create language. That if you haven't done something, how do you create the language? How do you talk about it? How do you challenge a metaphor of your language through experience? So this method of Sloyd education came across to the United States in 1892 at the Chicago World's Fair, and actually 75,000 teachers in the United States were trained in Sloyd, which goes from a concrete to abstract, bringing things that are made in the home, at school into the home. There was actually a woman in Santa Barbara who wrote a beautiful book around paper Sloyd, which is kind of like the precursor, if you will, in a different culture to origami, where everything that was made in school was practical and made for the home, and so the school entered the home through objects. And the objects are either you or become a part of you. You've made that continues out in the world. You could argue about the agency of an object as a person, as a thing. And so I would say that whole movement died, as Larry said, the Sloyd education movement, which was proliferating in the United States because of World War I, and then because of World War II, and instead of getting the Sloyd system, we got the Prussian system. And the Prussian system was an industrial system and can be traced back to where we are today.
Okay, so while you're thinking of questions to ask, so this is a two-way thing, being here with Elliot reminds me of Ted Sizer, who was a mentor to both of us, who passed away a few years ago. And right over here, our camera operator, Brent came with me to interview Ted right before he passed away. And that makes me remember what was in that interview, because I asked him what was the moment in his career that he really started to think about learning differently, and he said that he was in the Army and at Fort Devens in Massachusetts, and they had to shoot ordnance into a bullseye, and it was all math. And there was this working class kid next to him who couldn't do the math at all, but he could put every single thing he shot into a bucket. And then he started to think, he said, then he started to realize not only did he need to think about intelligence in a different way, he started to realize that the more narrowly we define intelligence, the more broadly we've defined what's not intelligence. And the more narrowly we define what is motivationable for a learner, we've defined more broadly what is not motivationable for a learner. And that was a great insight. So if anyone here has some questions, we really want to hear from you all, or anyone else on the panel want to take a shot. We'll wait. The critical wait, we call this. And also, when you ask a question, say something about yourself and what you teach, because that's always good to know. Oh, yeah?
Turn to the person sitting next to you. Talk about what you're wondering.
There's somebody.
All right, there we go.
Got it.
Everyone knows that move, right, in the classroom when they say any questions and then it's silent? Okay.
So my name's Krista Wolf and I teach art. So my question is actually about what you were talking about, the shift from, I think you said sloy to Prussian. So the agency of an object to a movement towards industrialization. Can you explain a little bit more about that and maybe give some references to where I could find more information about that?
Yeah, I can give you a lot, but I could talk to you about that afterwards. So, Sloyd, you just Google Sloyd and you'll find it in the Otto Solomon, the Swedish system, Signaeus. It also comes out of a fellow who's still alive named Frank Wilson, who's retired, who was a neurologist at Stanford, and he wrote a book that was runner-up to the Pulitzer Prize, and the book is called The Hand. And the premise of the book is that the hand informs the mind as much as the mind informs the hand, and this is not about the development of objects, this is about the development of the self. And Dewey was about this, a lot of people were about objects of interest. And psychologists are about, I mean, that word object appears all the time, and it's the making of the object that is very, very powerful. If you watch that movie, that Tom Hanks movie was like Robinson Crusoe, and he cuts himself, Castaway, and his hand goes on the volleyball, and he calls it Wilson, which is Frank Wilson. We always kid around about that. Well, is that volleyball now him or his buddy? And it's a really good philosophical, educational discussion. So there's a ton written about this, and there's a ton written about the motivation, motivational psychology, and interests around objects that are made. And I would argue that if you make objects, and we don't measure this, once again, we measure empathy only by something called, you start crying or you're laughing or whatever. But if you make an object, you have empathy for other people who make objects. It's a different kind of empathy that you feel for the world around people who make. And these are real powerful things. So it's a very long conversation. I'll stop it there. But Frank's book, The Hand, is very, very good. Articles on Sloyd are good. And there's a book by an anthropologist named Tim Ingold that came out last year called Making, which is about not just the making of the objects, but the relationships that people have in a community of practice around the making of those objects, which is also real powerful that we ignore in career and technical education. You can have the skills, but you may not have the relationships to get to the work. So it's not just a certification program, it's also a relational program.
Hey, Victor, can you tell us how your school is a little bit different from other schools?
Well, without having read the research you cited, we work from that premise that the relationships are imperative. You can't even talk about the object until those, not until, but certainly while that relationship is being formed. And that relationship, if truly authentic, has to permeate in every way possible, right? So it goes outside of the classroom, outside of the building, into their neighborhoods, into their discourse as we're shaping and creating a new discourse. And so I think that that's one of the things that we're shaping and feeling some pride around that we do well. I don't know that our objects and our exhibitions reflect some of the quality of work that I've seen here today, but the relationships are forming in really, really strong ways.
Thank you. Albert, you went on this bizarre Genghis Khan to the rest of us, venture of learning around the world that has influenced a lot of young people who've experienced it, secondarily through your presentations. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that was?
Yeah, well, I think some of you guys remember from last time, and there's a bunch of new faces as well, but for those who didn't hear my story, it was about 9 years ago that I finished my PhD, and like I said, was kind of shell-shocked with this reality that I had to find something to do with it. And at the same time, I think a lot of engineers are left with this sense that they're not supposed to be human, right? Like, you can only think very critically about all this other stuff, but we're all human, so I rejected the idea that I was going to get a job and just went and tried to figure out more about my own ancestral past. So I went into the world and started learning about my past, and in that I started finding all these different things that I was really curious about. One more than anything, which was where Genghis Khan is. And I mean, the whole story behind that's pretty deep and goes back further. Actually, last night, my son, who is a student here, he found this old tape recording. He found like this old recorder that I used to travel around with and record, people's voices. And he put the batteries in it. It didn't have batteries that were still there. They put the batteries in it, and all the data was still there. And I was shocked. I was like, I can't believe it's still here. And he plays the first little thing, and it was this song that these Mongolian nomads and I were singing on some like fireside camp up on the border of Russia and Mongolia, and it was this like super like deep song, and my son started dancing around. He's like, "Daddy, you were with the Indians, with the Native Americans?" I was like, "No, this was in Mongolia," but it sounded just like the sort of Native American tribal chants, and he was so into it, and I was so into it. I got so moved that last night I was literally dreaming about Mongolia again. I was dreaming about this thing. So then I applied, back then I didn't realize it, but it became this thing that was within me, that everything, all my different sort of skills I was going to apply towards this curiosity, and in one sense or another I ended up building this project to search for the tomb of Genghis Khan using all these tools in engineering, from satellites to drones to ground penetrating radar to all these other things. But really, it was just an excuse to get deeper into that song that I was hearing, this sort of very ancient connection to who I am. I just wanted to just be there all the time. But then I built these technologies that allowed people to participate in that. So, one thing is we had millions of people around the world searching through satellite imagery data to search for this tomb in satellite imagery. And they would actually guide my horse around. And I would literally download the data every single day on my satellite modem and ride out on horseback and find stuff that they were pointing me to. And I think at that point, I started getting all these emails from people saying, "Oh, we did this thing and we're finding all this stuff." And this one person said that she actually quit her job to go back to work, to go back to grad school to be an archaeologist, which, might not be the easiest career path in the world, but she did it. And I realized that, that sense of wonder that the world is still full of mysteries is something that not a lot of people realize, not a lot of people experience. But we are in this totally new age of exploration where there's so much data about what's happening on the planet that there's so many secrets that could be unlocked if we just figured out how to sift through all that data. And there, in that virtual world, is this opportunity to engage all of the kids in our classrooms around the country. Because if they take part in the actual scientific challenge of the unknown, rather than reading about the facts that they have to sort of memorize and all this other stuff, then they're going to realize that, like, this is a process of discovery. It's about discovery. I mean, it's literally about the adventure that has driven our human species to all the far corners of the earth and to the moon and now to Mars. It's about that idea that we don't know what's really out there, and that's what keeps on driving our curiosity. I feel like that might be, you know, my Mongolian chanting song.
Yes, right here. Here's a microphone for you. Yeah.
There's a teacher shortage. So I'm assuming that's actually through most of California too. And so I'm curious, when I look at some of the beginning teacher programs that I see, and I see lists of courses that involve like effective classroom management strategies or assessment or preparing students, you know, yada, yada. I'm curious if you had the opportunity to create a course that you thought all beginning teachers should take, what that title might be, or maybe two things that you think new teachers entering the profession, either recruiting them or helping sustain them, should really focus on. What are those essential elements?
Well, I'll take them first. Well, assessment and management are both control courses, you know. My son went to high-tech. Employees, kids get in automatically under California law for charters as long as it's less than 10% of the population. My son went to Cal Berkeley and from here, and I was up there visiting him. The dean's a friend of mine, and I was going up there some Thursday nights to see him. And my other boy's a tattoo artist up there, so I have dinner with both of them. And she said, "Why don't you teach a class up here?" I said, "What do you want me to teach?" So whatever you want to teach. I want to teach a class called New School Creation because there's 1,400 graduate schools of education in the United States, and there's a lot of people starting schools. No one teaches a course on how to start a school. So we did that, and actually worked with some other people here on it. And I think I taught the course backwards. Okay, I did it for 5 years. Then we made a MOOC out of it, which is actually on Coursera, if you wanted to see it. The way I taught it was, where is the school? Okay, why is it in that area, right? What is the building like, is the second class. How do you select the teachers is the third class. How do you select the students is the fourth one. And then the next one is, what are they all doing, right? So after doing it that way for a few years, I think it's taught backwards. I think now it should be, what are they all doing? Who are the students? Who are the kids? What facility are they in? And where is it? And then the other course that we taught that came out of that, because of what we heard about the MOOC, because it's, you know, it's online, so you get a lot of feedback, was the kids were the best part. The kids were the best part. Surprise, surprise, the kids are the best part of every school. So now we have another MOOC on Coursera called How to Teach Us by Kids. So that's a student voice course on the way that they learn best from themselves, and it's precious, I think. So that's my answer. Anybody else want to take a shot at that? I mean,
yeah. Well, I would say asking some very simple questions all the time around what are you interested in, and bringing the outside of school inside, and the inside of school outside. Is very, very simple to do, and yet it's not done enough. And another question around assessment, which is an important question for us and for me personally, is asking students how they think they did on something that matters to them. And if you ask them how they think they did, you're going to get a legitimate answer if it means something to them, if it's meaningful. I got to read these 3 books next. I got to meet these 2 people. I got to travel over here. I got to do this and that. I got to practice harder. So very, very simply, I don't think people ask that question enough. And I don't think people ask the question around, what are you really interested in? What are your choices? What matters to you? Very, very simple stuff.
One other thing I'm thinking about, your great question, since we have, because we're nuts, we created a graduate school of education, and you're in it right now. I mean, it took us 8 years. I take the great risk of saying our authorizers were absolutely allergic to the notion that you should have a graduate school of education embedded in K-12 schools. And so Ted Sizer, again, Dean of the Ed School at Harvard at 31, he once said, not having a graduate school of education that's not embedded in K-12 schools would be like having a medical school where you never see a body, right? So you're asking a really profound question about teacher education and teacher preparation. And of course, I want to go back to this question of equity, because if we assume that matters of equity, and I do assume that that's the biggest challenge for all of us all the time, are matters of equity. And in most graduate schools of education, you'll see that that is faintly addressed. Yeah. Anyone else got a question there? Yeah, go ahead.
So Larry brought up an interesting thing, because if you look at that Rembrandt painting of the doctors looking at the autopsy, that's actually a butcher performing the autopsy, or a barber at the time, because doctors were not allowed to touch patients. That's that practice stuff and touch stuff, and that's why we have the doubting Thomas who put his hand on Christ's heart to see if he was alive or dead. And that's the doubting Thomas thing. That's a big deal that you're not supposed to touch in schools.
My name is Adam, and I teach and live up near Yosemite. And right before I became a teacher, I was lucky enough to go to India, and I got to take a class with the Prime Minister of Tibet and Satish Kumar and a couple other, and Vandana Shiva and a couple other Gandhi experts. And the class was all about sustainability and Gandhi's views of education. And it was interesting hearing about like their view going forward for the United States in education. And one of the things they talked about was how in India's sort of break away from colonialism, how Gandhi's view of education was really important to establish not just sustainability in villages, but also solidarity. And I was just, it sounds like, and it appears that that's what's happening in this movement, but also just if you could talk about the solidarity of education and equity in communities of this sort.
Well, I'll free associate on that one just for one bit while people here are thinking, you know, because Elliot and I came from the Northeast. Special ed law, IDEA, Massachusetts was the first state in the United States to have a special education law called Chapter 766 in the 70s. And then Kathy Bounty, someone whose board I'm actually on, wrote most of IDEA, special ed. The ethos of Chapter 766 is something that I still think is exquisite today, and I don't know if others agreed. And that was sometimes, and this is how you get to solidarity, in my opinion. That's my answer about matters of equity and social justice. The ethos of Chapter 76 was sometimes you need to treat people differently in order to treat them equally. So that would be my first take on a moment. You know, I like aphorisms because I think aphorisms help rather than big treatises. That way you're always remembering that, because we are so inclined to put, you know, the tall ones over there and the short ones over there and the fat ones over there and the skinny ones over here and the bright ones over there and the not bright. We're so much in a society that categorizes like crazy, and to stop that tendency is our big challenge. And since we have a lot of career and voc teachers like I was, what about the notion, if you look at the data, you know, 15 years of teaching carpentry, okay, if 20% of all of the students I taught worked as a carpenter for at least a day after they graduated, that was a lot. So what is our purpose in career and technical education if in fact it shouldn't be limited to narrow skill training for a specific occupation, but we also know it's a great way to get at a host of other issues in addition to that training for a specific occupation. I don't know if anybody wants to take that on. It's kind of a dicey one for all of us. And while I'm waiting, internships, you know, from this really interesting data about internships, and we're here, and that's part of our agenda here. There was a great study by Jobs for the Future. Adria Steinberg, who worked on it, was just here last week. Over 7 years in Boston, they took comparable white students and comparable black students who had comparable GPAs, right? And the ones, and then they had, and the black students had internships and the white students did not have internships, right? But they started as comparable ones. The black students who had internships, performance in terms of college entrance and college completion was off the charts higher. And the intervening variable was working with somebody in the real world outside of school. And that which that comes from School to Work Opportunities Act of 1992, if you remember it. And is anybody here doing internships? Some people. I would like you to say something about your internships. I was telling somebody this morning, I was invited with Claudia Arana, a Salvadoran immigrant student, to present her work at the signing of that law in the White House in '92, in May of '92. And I stood next to her when she was presenting her work that she did at Polaroid to Bill Clinton. And it was very sophisticated work that she did, and he thanked her for her work. And she said, well, I really want to thank you because I have to present this to my supervisors at Polaroid tomorrow, and I'm very nervous about that, so I really appreciate this opportunity for a dry run today. And she said, she meant it, you know. Of course, he found that, he loved it. But anybody here, saw a hand come up. So, can you tell us about your internship program you run in the middle there? No? Medical, tell us about them. Can you tell us about them? Microphone.
In their various internships, and then they meet with me once a week. And there are a variety of internships. Some are more meaningful than others. Off the top, I have some inpatient care technician jobs where they're learning how to do dialysis and administer dialysis. I have some in EKG. I have some in, just off the top of my head, Shriners Hospital, different hospitals around.
I've asked my friend over here to talk about her type of constructivism with the thing. I watch her videos and stuff, actually, so I know all about her.
Yeah, so I showed a lot of it this morning. Yeah, I guess, so definitely, this is not like a self-promo plug, but the film, If You Build It, which is about this farmer's market that my very first class of high school students built in our Studio H program, is a really beautiful film. Like, it's not actually about me. It's about these students and like the amazing journey, like emotional and academic, and like they're hilarious. They're such caricatures, and they're from this like tiny town, and it's a really great film. And I think it illustrates really well that like we were building a farmer's market. That was the artifact. But really, like, that didn't, I mean, it mattered. It mattered to me. It was beautiful. It was an architectural record. Like, it was amazing. It created all these jobs. But really, the artifact is, like, at the end, this intangible, qualitative, like, just straight up badassery that all these kids, like, now walk through the world. Like, oh, yeah, I built this thing for my town, and it's 2,000 square feet, and it created 4 businesses and like 15 jobs, which is twice as many as Domino's created when they came here. You know, it's like they can say that now. And so, you know, I can talk about like literally nuts and bolts about any of these projects, but it really is about that. And I guess the one that I didn't show this in my presentation this morning, but one of my favorite projects, which is not actually a piece of architecture, but I alluded to this in the girls' camp 2 summers ago, where we built furniture and that playhouse for the domestic violence women's shelter. And there was a little girl who came to camp on a scholarship who lived in the shelter with her mother. And so we were building this playhouse, and she was like one of the project managers on the playhouse that she would then be playing in. And I remember asking her, like, are you okay? Like, how are you managing to think about this? That like you're in this camp with some girls who are very privileged, some who are not, but like you're the only one that's coming from this organization that we are working for. Like, what do you think of that? And she's like, are you kidding? I'm so excited to have this thing and like to be able to build this thing. And it's like it didn't even matter to her. She just wanted the agency to be constructing something that was for her own environment. And so I think about her a lot, and I think about that sense of what you were referring to about the object as being an extension of yourself. Like, you build this thing and it's for others, but it's also for you, and it's like a piece of you. It becomes like your limb out in the world. So yeah, I mean, the projects themselves as built things in the world, I think, are beautiful and architectural, and if you saw them without a caption underneath, I don't think you would assume they're built by teenagers. I think they're stunning. And that's important to me too, that they can stand alone as like really, really beautiful work. And kids are capable of that. It's phenomenal. Like,
I'd like to hear from people about great things that students made in any shop that you're in. I'll start by, I do remember Jimmy, I won't give you his last name, when he made a hash pipe in carpentry class, and I said, Jimmy, you can't make a hash pipe in carpentry class. He said, that's not a hash pipe. I said, oh really, what is it? He said, that's a tunnel for my ant farm. Nice. Okay, I'm sure you don't have to tell stories. You know I didn't make that up. So tell us some stuff. Tell us some stuff that whatever kind of shop you're in, it would be great to hear about some work that kids did that you feel really good about, and anybody up here as well. This very shy crowd right now. You have someone to nominate. Okay, okay, good. There you go.
I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I used to teach graphic design, and while I was there, we developed a 4-year pathway where my level 4 students created and ran their own business and did design work for the community. Really, really high quality. They ended up being better designers than me. I mean, amazing work, and it was, I'm very proud of them, and most of them went on to either major or minor in graphic design, and they're working through college and designing for other people and making money while they're in school or taking time off school, but still designing really high quality work.
Yeah, great. Anyone else? Thank you for a contribution there. Come on. I guess it's end of the day time. Oh, do you have one? You got one? No. Okay, you got one.
Oh, I just wanted to, I'm not going to put these people on the spot, but when we were in the protocol, there were a couple of projects that were just like ridiculously amazing, and I was like blown away. So I won't put these people on the spot, but this really great film like a 10-minute film that was like seriously Hollywood quality. It was amazing, and it was the script for it came from a short story, from a college level at short story creative writing class. Is that right? Oh no, the high school. You go ahead.
She put me on the spot.
Sorry.
It's okay. No, so we have a cross-curriculum project that we work with our creative writing department, which this year we've expanded to our animation department. And what we did was we had the creative writing team or class wrote 30 short stories. And then from there, they did that the first semester. Second semester, they hand those over to our students. Excuse me. At that point, my students would read the short stories. What's it? Oh, sorry, I thought I had a hand go up. My students would read the short stories, and from that, they would select one short story that they were going to rewrite as a screenplay and then actually produce. So for this year, what we're doing is we then hand the script off to our animation department, and they start working on the storyboards while my students go out and they start scouting and trying to find actors. And the end result, we have a film exposition that we invite all of the schools from the area to come to, and then we invite all of our industry partners. And this year, we're hoping to have about 20 students walk out with internships at different studios, small and large. And then also tech shops where they do production setup, and then they'll also do post-production workflow, so they get into networking and computers and all of that stuff. So that's the big capstone project that we have for our cinema program at our school.
So at our schools, we've had tens of thousands of internships where students are making a lot of original stuff, from neon signs to developing and making airplanes and making lots of stuff, tons of stuff. But the point that I guess I'm trying to make is that back to the assessment question, and your question as well, is that it's not a question of just one test, which is the part of the conversation that we're having right now. If you look at Eva Moskowitz and Bill de Blasio in New York, it doesn't matter if it's charter or a union conversation. It's all about how somebody does on one test, when we don't have a conversation really about multiple measures. And so There was a fella named Robert Richards who was one of the first graduates of MIT in the 1890s, and he served on this school board for 65 years, the Elliot School in Boston, which was a craft school and a trade school. And I'm always reminded of the question, and he always said, it's the child we're making, not furniture. And so it's not just about that object or that product. It's what you're doing in the classroom around the development of the self. And our departments of education don't like to talk about the developments of the self. Don't talk about that. We're only interested in grades, when all of us up here are really interested about how is that child going to make their way through the world. And that's part of what we do and why we do it. So that's a piece of this.
Just riffing off of that, yesterday I had this friend of mine who came to visit from Harvard, and he had his son with him, and his son was looking at schools, and I was telling him, you know, about the stuff that I've been doing, and then I started talking about like the new sort of world of education that I've experienced with High Tech High and everything, and this kid, you know, son of a senior professor in the Harvard Business School, like very, you know, grew up in a world that was kind of unique. He kept on talking about, you know, well, project-based is great, it's a great movement, but, you know, I prefer to be more prepared for college, and, you know, so I can get through college. And then I remember saying to him, I was like, well, what happens after college then? You know, I mean, what's the point of going through all this structure and assessments and these single tests when really in the real world that's just not relevant at all? And then I'm reflecting on what I do at the university now. So I have a handful of students that I take on as my research students that are undergraduates as well as graduate students. But like I never look at grades as what's going to, you know, be the make or break for them to be on these expeditions at all. In fact, I hope that they are not doing well in their grades because if they are, then they're obsessed with the wrong piece of the pie. And I look at the things that have come out of that. You know, some kids have gone on to start their own companies, to, you know, take on their own lives, and it's just, you know, I compare that to the kids that are so obsessed with the grades. And those kids just seem so, I mean, the ones that are obsessed with the grades, they seem so unhappy. I mean, just like so unhappy, you know, because they have to go out and compete for, you know, a cog in a wheel job. I was really interested by your comment about solidarity, and I was trying to figure out, it's just been like digging into my brain for a little bit. And I think what I understand from that is like, what's the role of solidarity? Maybe, for me, you know, I started thinking about it in the context of inspiration, right? You know, when I think about our society and when we've had some of the biggest moments of inspiration, you know, like our land on the moon moments. I think about landing on the moon and, you know, all of the sort of energy that went into that across the whole nation. And I don't think we have that many big sort of moonshots, right? Like there's not really that many of them. And for me, I feel like, you know, I'll talk to you guys about this on Friday, but you know, the career pathways, there's like your individual career pathway, and then there's our societal career pathways and our global career pathways, and, you know, collectively, it just doesn't seem like there's a lot that kids are like sort of working on towards a greater good yet. Like, you know, but we face some of the biggest challenges of our, you know, 10,000 year time frame as a society that works in little villages and everything like that. I mean, we are facing one of the most critical moments of our lives as a human species or as a co-inhabitants of this planet. And maybe there's stuff that we can get behind from a solidarity standpoint that gives, you know, the child that I see in my children, you know, a sense of purpose, grander purpose behind their individual career paths. You know, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out what you meant by that, because it came from Gandhi, so it must have been like there's got to be something cool there, right? But I was just trying to figure out what you meant by that. Maybe you can expand.
Well, I think Gandhi had like all the different points of solidarity, like
Adam.
Food solidarity, fiber. Building, you know, learning how to build your own house, learning how to farm, but all those elements of solidarity within the movement of freeing India conceptually and physically from their oppressors. So, like, I guess Gandhian education is like the solidarity of, well, and to some extent, I guess Gandhi was an anarchist too, because he believed in a sustainable network of communities that were all interconnected through different ideas of humanity, but not necessarily through a central government. But like his idea of solidarity was like education was the roots that connected it all for all those people.
Hello.
Hi.
So hi everyone, I'm Tina, and I'm up at the North County campus, and I was here last week for 3 days. And I left, and I had a mid-career crisis, and I called my director, and I was like, oh my God, there's all these amazing people, and they've done so much with their lives, and they've made this huge impact on education, and what am I doing with my life? And anyway, he talked me down off the ledge. But what I'd like to do to end today is I would like each of you to, just in a couple sentences, what impact do you hope to have on the world of education? So maybe you need some think time.
Great.
Larry's got his go-to, though. Go ahead.
Who's ready first?
For me, you know, it's very personal. I want my kids to have a great education, and that's less about memorizing a bunch of stuff and more about being super inspired once they get out and, you know, feeling like they have the tools to do it, do whatever they want and dream up.
Maybe my answer is still trying to figure out the solidarity question also. Well, it's interesting because we've been talking about this kind of dichotomy in the work that we do also, and so maybe by default there are these two camps, there are these two sort of existence that we seem to be grappling with. And I don't know how many of you work in a district or at a school site where there is the educational program and then there's the CTE. So isn't that a contradiction to solidarity in the very acute sense? And so I was thinking about it from that kind of a response. But trying to answer your question, I also think of myself as a disruptor in many ways, and not with an intentionality of just disrupting for the sake of disrupting, but I love challenging the kind of like the progress that we've made and looking at it really critically. I love talking about race and class and how those things impact our schools. It's a very comfortable conversation that I like to have with folks, and really from a place of inquiry sometimes, and sometimes from a very defensive place. But it's an important conversation because that's what our kids come into the building with. And so as I think about, or as I'm still perplexed by the notion of solidarity, I want my work to reflect the things that I've disrupted, to hopefully create a new narrative, a new discussion, a new way of thinking about how we approach the problems that we're talking about. And I feel like one of the difficult things for us to get to, because we're bogged down with, we don't really know how to interact with one another outside of this space, outside of this building in particular. We go to spaces that are still comfortable, to neighborhoods that are comfortable. I did that during lunch. I went to Barrio Logan. I had to go eat at Las Cuatro Milpas. I used to live close to there, and I needed to go back there. When I go back there, I'm sitting there with my ancestors, and it was an important thing for me to do. But then I'm uncomfortable sitting here. As I walked in, and I felt like I was one of probably 2 or 3 Latino men in the room also. And so I'm cognizant of those things, and so I want my work to reflect some changes in those trajectories also.
I don't know what to say. I'm trying to come up with some very poetic answer. I don't have it. I think that I want my impact to be, I'm just going to say it, I want little girls to feel like they can kick anyone's ass. That's sort of a personal, that's very much about my history. And so I think your answer about it is personal. It's personal, and it's okay, and it's good that it's personal. So I think that's one thing that's very specific. I think more broadly, to use an overused term, I want every person that comes in contact with my program or walks into Realm or whomever to leave with like a deep hunger for learning, whether you're like 12 or 72 or whatever. Like, I don't understand how people get bored. Like, I don't get that. Like, look around. There's so much amazing stuff. And I guess it's that. Like, just the idea of lifelong learning, we use that term, we throw it around, but like really being invested in our own learning and paying that forward.
Impact's a funny word for me. So I think about those questions once again, about what do you like to do? What do you want to get better at? How are you going to get better at it? And how do you think you did? There's questions I'd like to hear more, and more questions like that. And to get people off of thinking about certainty and get to understanding. As I got a magician buddy who says, beware of when ambiguity is reduced to certainty and the physical is reduced to the mental. So that's a little heavy thing to think about, but those are kind of things that I think about a lot.
What? For me, I want young people to feel like this is them, they can do it. I just essentially see teaching as an act of respect and love. And I think it's really fortunate for all of us who have an opportunity to work with young people. It's a gift that we should treat delicately and with profound appreciation for what they can do. Thanks, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Thank you so much.